Well, welcome back to our third week of social distance learning. This is a continuation of a discussion we've been having on spontaneous order. Last week we talked about the easy case of spontaneous order and the harder case of spontaneous order. But now we're going to get into the hardest case of spontaneous order. And to do that, we need to talk about the ability of spontaneous order to effectively facilitate social cooperation relative to what government does. Now, admittedly, this is a very small sample size because most of the world today has government running countries. The hardest case of spontaneous order requires that we really have no government to speak of running the social order of a country. Now, because governments run countries, this leads critics to say that spontaneous order doesn't work, that there's really no such thing. Now, that being said, there's a whole school of thought on economics called the public choice school of thought that says, yeah, governments run things, but they don't do it very well, and they end up creating more problems because of the incentives that are put in front of a governmental body. They don't allocate resources well. They're choked with bureaucracy. So not everybody agrees with government and government running things and government creating a better social order. We do have historical examples, though, of nations functioning well under a regime where there basically is no government. So perhaps to compare spontaneous order to governmental structure, those are the places we need to look. However, the examples are somewhat unique. For example, one of those examples is medieval Iceland, where where a very small community is set up and a formal governmental structure simply isn't needed. And if you compare that to the rest of medieval Europe, you may walk away saying, yeah, Iceland actually had a really good system going. There weren't lots of wars. There weren't religious persecutions. It just seemed like the social structure in medieval Iceland was superior to what was going on in the rest of Europe. But again, that's maybe not the best form of comparison. What we really need is a feasible and legitimate comparison to what's going on in the rest of the world. Comparing medieval Iceland to the modern United States seems like not just mixing apples and oranges, but like mixing apples and hand grenades. They're just two totally different things. So specifically what we want to look for is whether or not there are good examples of spontaneous order structuring countries and kind of coordinating the activities of people within countries where there's great wealth generated. We have the US, we have Western Europe, and we have Japan, but those all have forms of government. That being said, a lot of the world has forms of government, but they don't have the wealth of the US, Western Europe, and Japan. So do we fall into the trap of saying that the correlation between wealthy countries and government is causation? So one modern case study that we might want to consider is Somalia. The modern day country of Somalia has gone through a lot of just horrible things. In 1991, the government essentially failed completely and shut down, leaving the country in an utter state of anarchy, which does provide us with some opportunity here to compare states of the world. Prior to the collapse of the government, the GDP per person in Somalia was about $150 annually. We can take a look at the data and see if things have gotten any better since the collapse of that pretty horrible government. So here's a graph and some of the data that go along with what happened in Somalia. Now, admittedly, the veracity of the data is somewhat in question, but we can see that since that time, GDP per person has increased. Now, the country is certainly not wealthy. It's not that all of a sudden the citizens of that country are making $10,000 a year or even $1,000 a year. But things do seem to improve somewhat after that failed governmental state goes away. The people of Somalia become wealthier, not necessarily wealthy. And maybe that's a product of spontaneous order. Maybe it's that people, unburdened and unshackled by a bad government, are able to actually make some progress towards improving their standard of living. But does this prove the case that spontaneous order is better? Well, I think clearly we can't make that leap. Spontaneous order might have helped here, but it might have been because things were so bad to begin with. So maybe what we need to do is look at spontaneous order relative to government in terms of deviations. It's probably best to say, it's probably most accurate to say that the first best form of government where property rights are protected, where government provides some degree of public goods, where basically we go back to government doing the things that Adam Smith said that government should do. And if government does those things, it's going to outperform the first best options in terms of spontaneous order. But perhaps it's at the second and third best governments that the second and third best versions of spontaneous order outperform. In other words, deviating from the first best version of government creates large welfare losses that might be recaptured, might be captured for the first time through versions of second best spontaneous order. So moving from the second and third best options of government to a spontaneously ordered society might eliminate some of those welfare losses and might even create some welfare gains. And it's at this point that the actual comparisons should be made. So that raises the question, how far can we go with spontaneous order? Let's take a look at the conditions that are necessary for spontaneous order to be successfully implemented. So economists have been looking at spontaneous order for a long time. One of the more, preeminent scholars of spontaneous order is a guy named Peter Leeson. Pete is a professor at George Mason University. He actually wrote the book, literally, on economics and pirates. And we pulled some of that material from his book last week. But he wrote a paper dealing with what conditions constrain the scope of spontaneous order. And he looked at two things specifically. So these are the two conditions that constrain the scope of spontaneous order. So what are those conditions? Well, the first thing is violence. Without government, there is clearly the real threat of some stronger group in society stealing from the weaker group in society. So without government to restrain that violence, then it's likely that violence will sort of permeate society. So this might mean that spontaneous order is kind of out of luck. There's just there's the proclivity of man to be violent, and as a result of this, spontaneous order is going to fail because violence will necessitate the revival or the establishment of government. The second condition is what we call social heterogeneity. This occurs where communication is very difficult, or the norms and beliefs and the culture and the values amongst people living together are just so different that if it's difficult, if not impossible, to have everyone understand how self-enforcing cooperation should work. So in this case, what Leeson is saying is that the more diverse society is, the less likely spontaneous order is to exist, because people just don't understand what it means to cooperate, because their cultures are just so very different. And the result of having government means that violence will be reduced. It basically prevents the strong from opposing the weak, and it reduces the risks of interacting with diverse strangers, because government is there to protect the integrity of contracts. So these are the two conditions that might constrain how much spontaneous order, or how successful spontaneous order is. Now, continuing on with what Leeson says about spontaneous order, we can look at the economic justification for government, and that is to organize society to transform the situations of potential conflict into situations of cooperation. So what we're doing here is we're going to try to transform conflict into cooperation. That's what government could do, and a good government will do that. People can follow one of two strategies when dealing with others. They can cooperate or they can defect. Cooperation means that individual behavior is going to be consistent with the ends of the other members of society. So people, when they're dealing with each other, can either cooperate, in which case the behaviors of the individual are consistent with the ends of the other members of society. So in a country, in an economy, or in a society where people cooperate, then we're sort of all moving towards the same end goals. This means that that trading and contributing to public goods and respecting property rights are all part of the ethos of society. But people could also defect. So this is the other option that people have. And if they defect, that means that their behaviors are going to benefit you, or benefit the individual, at the expense of the collective. So the behaviors of individuals benefits those individuals at the expense of others. And these would be the situations where we observe theft and free riding, and indeed the violence that might cause spontaneous order to break down. So let's see what this looks like in terms of social interaction. All right, let's put let's kind of put this together in the context of a game. We're going to take a look at a two-person game where your strategies are either to cooperate or to defect. So we're just going to put some letters in here for the values of potential cooperation, and we'll just do this sort of in just to make it a little bit easier here. So if both players cooperate, then they both get a payoff of A. If both defect, then they both get a payoff of B. What's interesting is what happens when one person cooperates when the other defects. So if one cooperates and the other defects, then the payoff for the cooperator is C, and the payoff for the defector is D. So here's the order of how valuable these payoffs are. D is preferred to A, which is preferred to B, which is preferred to C. And so this is for the individual. And 2 times A is preferred to D plus C, which is preferred to 2 times B. So this set of relationships down here, this is the collective. So individually, we see that people have a particular order under which they would prefer to have the payouts. But under the collective, what we see is that mutual cooperation is good for the society. The question is, can we get there? So let's put this information into a matrix, and we might be able to figure out what's going to happen here. So I'm going to put player A on this side. I'm going to put player B up here, and we'll construct our matrix using the payoffs that we just kind of illustrated. Again, the two options, the two strategies are to cooperate and to defect. We'll put player A's payoff in blue and player B in red. So remember, A and A gives us, that's the outcome if both players cooperate. B and B are what happens if both players defect. And then we had the situation where what happens if one player does one thing and the other player does the other. So in the southwest box, player A defects and gets value D, and player B gets value C, where D is the larger payout. So if player A defects and player B cooperates, player A is made better off. And if player A cooperates while player B defects, then player B is made better off. Because once again, just remember, D is preferred to A, is preferred to B, is preferred to C in terms of the payoffs for the individual. But 2 times A is better than C plus D, which is better than 2 times B. So for society, the best option, the efficient option is up here. So that's where society would like things to be. But if we look very carefully at this, we can see that that's unlikely to happen because this is a prisoner's dilemma game where the dominant strategy for both players ends up being to defect. So for instance, let's do a different slide for this. Let's say we've got our players. Here's A and here's B, and here are our here are the payoffs. We have A, C, B, and D, and we have A, B, C, and D for players. All right, so let's say that player B says, no matter what happens, I am going to defect. So essentially, we can just get rid of this stuff over here. Player B says, no matter what happens, I'm going to defect. Well, player A looks at that and says, well, if you're going to defect, the best option I have is to also defect because B is bigger than C. So for player A, if player B defects, the best option is to defect. Now, if player B says, no matter what happens, I'm going to cooperate, then player A looks at this and says, well, option D is better than option A, so to get to option D, I'm going to defect. So, no matter what player B does, A's best strategy is to defect. And you can work your way through this, this analysis for player B. Their best strategy is to also defect no matter what player A does. So we have this dominant strategy that's going to put us in the defect box, which means that everybody is worse off. If we were to set this up, set up these conditions, we would say that this is a one-shot game. And in the one-shot game, we get a suboptimal outcome because everybody's following their dominant strategy. By following the dominant strategy, society ends up in the worst position. So society is in this place where they would least like to be. Now that should be the anticipated outcome. And as a result of that, maybe we can set up the rules of the game through some changes in institutions to change this from a one-shot game to a repeated game. In the situation where we have a repeated game, it might be that we can change the outcome of this game. The repeated game might lead to the cooperative outcome. But some conditions must be met for that mutually beneficial outcome to result. Cooperation requires some very specific things. To get cooperation, we first of all need some people who are sufficiently patient. We need some sufficiently patient individuals who are willing to wait to get all the kinks worked out. We also need some low information sharing costs. we need some equally strong agents. So in other words, the participants in the game need to have an equal level of strength. So nobody can be dominant over the other. And then we also need shared ideas about defection and how it should be punished. So if we want cooperation, we need these 4 conditions minimally to be met. If they're not met, we're probably not going to get cooperation. So regardless of what we're looking at, cooperation is tenuous. Cooperation is, if it exists at all, it exists on a knife's edge, on a razor's edge, because these conditions that are required for cooperation are so rarely met. For example, the first condition is usually just assumed away. Remember, the first condition is that people are sufficiently patient. And if that existed in the real world, we wouldn't need government at all. And because government exists and it's so prevalent, it must mean that people aren't sufficiently patient. So we sort of assume this one away. The second condition was that there's low information sharing, and maybe that's the case, but the more heterogeneous society is, the more heterogeneous it is, the more difficulty we have in sharing that information. For example, let's say you live in a country where there are different languages. That can cause there to be a problem in identifying specific information that's necessary to, say, punish cheaters or identify defectors, and so it just becomes more difficult to have cooperation. The third point was that people were equally strong, and this seems a little bit ridiculous because in most situations there are some members who are stronger than others. That might mean in terms of their physical strength, so that the aggressor is met with little resistance, and so the strongest steals from the weak. But it could also be the politically connected. It can be the kind of the social climber. Realistically, people aren't equally strong. And because of that realization, cooperation is really difficult. And then finally, if members are diverse, then their belief of what it means to defect or what the appropriate punishments might be are also likely to be divergent. So again, this gets back to that idea of the more diverse or the more heterogeneous the group of people, then what it means to defect and how it should be punished so what punishments are appropriate, that's also going to be divergent. That means we've got a lot of problems. We've got a lot of problems for cooperation to exist. These are all, what we see here on this list, these are all real problems for a society. And any one can cause voluntary cooperation to quite easily break down. So, we have the very real possibility of this person entering the picture, where the government agent steps in and says, "We will fix these problems." State enforcement means that conditions 2 through 4 don't have to exist for cooperation to result in significant gains. So because of government, we can say that information sharing doesn't have to exist. And we can say that everybody being equally strong doesn't have to exist, because if somebody's oppressing the weak, we go to government. And the situation where there are common ideas about defection and how it should be punished, that doesn't have to exist either, because the government sets the rules and that's how it's going to be. So with government entering the picture, then we can alleviate these problems. So this is why spontaneous order is viewed as being so very limited in scope. If you look at government stepping in, clearing up these problems, here's spontaneous order over here. Let's kind of put this in the picture of a person. Here's the spontaneous order person. And we look at this person and we say, you know, you can just go away now. So off they go, and we don't have to worry about them, because there's no ability for them, for that spontaneous order to exist as long as we have government dealing with conditions 2 through 4. That being said, humans, at least the assumption in many cases, is that humans are rational. Not all the time, but enough of the time. And this means that they're going to follow their dominant strategies and they're not going to cooperate. If dominant strategy is to not cooperate, that's what humans are going to do. But because they are rational, they might also see the benefits of cooperation. This leads to what some economists call the human ant nest. The human ant nest. So here we have an ant. And we know what ants do. Ants are kind of known for, here's the ant hill. Ants are known for their degree of cooperation. So all the hard work that they put into storing up food for the winter, and just they work, and everybody has a role to play in the ant nest. So economists look at that cooperation, that cooperative behavior on the part of ants, and they say, well, how come humans don't act more like that on a regular basis? Well, part of it is because they're rational. Ants are kind of pre-programmed, but humans think for themselves. They try to achieve certain objectives because they're rational, and sometimes the individual self-interest conflicts with the social self-interest. And in the ant world, there's no failure of government to consider. Everybody follows what they're supposed to do. But in the human world, government can and often does fail. And when government fails, and they fail for at least 3 reasons. When governments fail, maybe it is incumbent upon humans to kind of back away from the government enforcement of things and look towards spontaneous order. One of the reasons governments might fail is that governments can be predatory. Government can be predatory. And when it doesn't provide punishments that are necessary to coordinate people. So the punishments don't do what they're supposed to. When governments don't do what they're supposed to, it might be that they are too light. In other words, that government is sort of showing favoritism towards the people who support it, or it might be too heavy, it might be too harsh, where the government really cracks down excessively upon people. And we tend to see this predatory government exist in third world countries. These are the infamous, or I guess we should call them infamous, the infamous third world dictators, where they're just not doing the job that needs to be done to achieve order. Additionally, government can be very costly. And I don't just mean in terms of just the money that's spent, but also all of the just the opportunity costs that are part of what goes on. So, for example, if the costs of government are greater than the social benefits that result when government coordinates activity, and maybe coordinate's not the right word, but when government moves people in the proper direction to increase efficiency, if it costs more to achieve that than the benefits, which are the benefits, if you remember back from our matrix, the benefits of mutual cooperation were 2 times A. If the costs of government are greater than 2 times A, then there's no government. Why would you have government if it costs more than the benefits that you're receiving? And then people go follow their dominant strategies, and they go to that defect outcome. So if government's too costly, then there's not going to be government, and we don't receive the benefits from that. The third reason government might fail is because government can't be everywhere at once. And so our interactions are occurring outside the view of the state, so the state may not be able to coordinate activity towards the social good because it can't be part of every single transaction. Even if the state could be everywhere, and all of the problems that are on our list could be solved, is that really what we want? Would the costs of having government everywhere be worth paying? One of the more interesting comics that I've ever read is a kind of a what if story where Superman ends up landing in the Ukraine instead of landing in Kansas when he initially comes to Earth. And because Superman is who he is, he follows the institutions that under which he's raised. So we know Superman is fighting for truth, justice, and the American way because he's raised in Kansas, and his farmer parents teach him the right way to live. Well, in this particular story called Superman Red Sun, Superman ends up being raised on a farm collective where everybody is beholden to the Communist Party. And when Stalin dies, Superman takes over and kind of imposes his will upon the planet. Because he's Superman, he can hear everything and see everything, and he knows everything about all transactions. And he seeks to make them as efficient as possible. But there are some failures. There are some significant failures. So even if government, and in this case Superman is the government, or he becomes the government, even if the government can be everywhere at once and solve all the problems, is that really the way we want to live? And in this story we see that basically everybody's scared to death every waking moment of the day because they're worried they're going to do or say something that's going to make Superman upset. And that's not a world where we have efficient interactions. And so because the state can't be everywhere at once, and that's probably a good thing, there's going to be some failure that exists on the part of government. So the last thing I want to deal with for this particular lecture is to take a look at spontaneous order when we have threats of violent action. Of course, the threat for violence exists because of strength disparities between the actors. When the gap is large enough between the strong and the weak, then the strong are likely to find that just taking what they want is far more efficient for them than actually participating in a normal economic transaction. And spontaneous order might just be ineffective at stopping these kinds of things. At least that's what we might think. But there's actually a really interesting historical case where this idea of the strong subjugating the weak doesn't play out, even when there's not a strong or even moderately effective government in place at all. So let's see what spontaneous order has to tell us about creating a situation or a condition where even though the strong could oppress the weak, they actually don't. So here's our case study from 19th century Angola. Here's a map with Angola illustrated on it, just in case you're not familiar with where Angola is. What's going on in this situation, or in this case study, is that Europeans have come to trade. And the way trade is taking place creates a very divergent relationship in terms of the strength of the two parties. The trade is in some things that Angolans were really good at providing. On the one side, we have the European agents. These essentially are the African middlemen who have to report to the Europeans. These middlemen are armed, they're mobile, they travel in packs. This is the strong side of the equation. And they are going to be dealing with the producers of things that the Europeans want. The producers are the native Angolans, and they are really good at producing rubber, ivory, beeswax, and slaves. So this is the trade that's going to take place. And on one side we have the strong, and on the other side we have the weak. While the strong come and say, this is what we will give you for these things, they could conceivably just come and take them. Theft certainly did occur between these two groups, but the vast majority of trades did not involve violence. And Angola exported a lot of things to Europe during this time period. The African interior, which included Angola, was basically stateless. There is no real government involved. There are these far-flung communities with very limited access to the coast, and that limited access puts the Angolan traders at a distinct disadvantage. On this side of the equation, there's not much going for these people in terms of strength in the negotiations. However, they're very much incentivized to find a solution to their weak position because of the gains to them that can be made in global markets, without which they would earn very little. So an institution developed for the purpose of helping to facilitate trade between these two groups. And interestingly, it is an institution that we still use today. Not to say this is where it was created, but it was created out of a stateless society. And that institution is credit. What happened is, in these transactions, is that producers left goods unproduced until the last possible moment. So there wouldn't be anything really to steal. The middlemen are traveling to the interior, and if they do travel in there and they try to steal things, there's not going to be anything for them to steal. So here's the middleman. He's looking for things to steal. Here are the native producers waiting to produce things. Give him a chair here. Waiting to produce things. And we'll just say he's trying to get the beeswax out of the beehive here. But he's not going to do it until he knows those middlemen are on their way to come pick things up. The middlemen aren't just going to show up randomly, because travel to the interior is really expensive. There's really a costly, it's really costly for them to do so. So the producers say, look, we'll produce this stuff for you, but first you've got to pay up front. You got to pay up front, and we'll get you what you want. And we know we have to get you what you want, because if we don't, you're just going to come in and hurt us. So we have payment made up front. Goods are delivered after the payment has been made, with the threat of violence if production doesn't take place. So even without a government to enforce contracts, a mechanism by which contracts can be supported develops in this Angolan countryside. By indebting themselves to middlemen, there was no incentive to harm on the part of the strong, because if the middlemen hurt them, they simply wouldn't get their things. When the middlemen returned, then the only goods produced were what was owed. So if you steal, then you're not getting anywhere. You're just stealing the things that you've already paid for. And to get more, you need to renew the contract. So this whole process was incredibly efficient, an incredibly effective tool in order to get goods to the people who wanted them and to protect the people who were in a weaker position. So that this idea of credit emerges as a spontaneous institutional agreement. A spontaneous institutional agreement to prevent violence and to help both sides realize gains from trade. Despite no government and one side being stronger than the other. One last thing to note about this is that the opportunism that goes along with the credit deals, so basically the opportunism that the producer might have, the incentive the producer might have to just kind of take the money and run, well, that's eliminated by the strength of the middlemen who would have punished default, and probably punished it pretty severely. All right, well, I think that's a pretty good place to stop for today anyway. We've taken a look at spontaneous order in a world where violence, because there are two sides that are unequally matched in terms of strength, where violence might lead to a necessary evolution of government, or the creation and the control of government. Well, we've just seen a case study where that didn't need to happen. So while violence is likely a precursor to having government come in and try to establish order, it's not necessarily the case. The other issue that we need to deal with is heterogeneous groups, when you have different social and cultural norms that might preclude spontaneous order. What we're going to do when we get back together next class is take a look at that particular problem to see if spontaneous order can help overcome the the diversity in a population base.